Linda was a quiet woman, but she carried a strength within her that most people could not see at first glance. She had grown up in a small southern town, surrounded by tall oak trees, wide open fields, and a community that knew every neighbor by name. Her grandparents had once been farmers, working the land not just to survive but to build something lasting for their children and grandchildren. Through all the hardships of life, they held on to their property, refusing to let it slip away. When Linda was a little girl, she often followed her grandmother around the land. She remembered chasing butterflies in the tall grass and picking wildflowers that grew along the edges of the fields. Her grandmother would often stop, point to the soil, and say, "This ground is more than dirt, baby. This ground carries our blood, our sweat, and our hope. Never let anyone tell you it doesn't matter." Those words stayed with her, even as she grew into adulthood. After her grandparents passed away, the land was passed down to Linda through official deeds and documents. Unlike many families who lost their land because of missing papers or unclear ownership, Linda's grandparents had been careful. They kept every document safe, sealed in a wooden trunk that had been in the family for decades. When Linda opened it years later, she found yellowed papers with signatures, stamps, and legal seals that proved without a doubt that the land was theirs. As an adult, Linda lived a simple life. She worked in the city, but her heart was always tied to the land she inherited. It wasn't just property to her, it was a living piece of her family's story. Many of her friends encouraged her to sell it. Developers came knocking, offering large sums of money. They talked about turning the land into shopping centers, luxury homes, or entertainment spaces. At first, the offers seemed tempting, especially when money was tight. But each time, Linda remembered her grandmother's words. She always said no. The land remained quiet, untouched, and free. Linda didn't build anything new on it. She liked it that way. It gave her peace to know that there was a place where the world hadn't taken over. Sometimes, she would drive out there on weekends, park her car under the shade of the oldest oak tree, and just sit for hours listening to the sound of nature. To her, it was like going home. But things around her began to change. The town started growing faster than she expected. New neighborhoods appeared, schools expanded, and businesses moved in. What was once a quiet stretch of countryside was slowly being swallowed by concrete roads and housing developments. Real estate developers saw money everywhere. And soon, her land caught their attention. One year, a powerful homeowners association, better known as an HOA, began buying large areas of property near Linda's land. They had plans to build a grand new community with nearly 100 homes, parks, and even a clubhouse. The HOA was backed by wealthy investors who believed the land around Linda's was the perfect place to expand. They saw dollar signs, not history. At first, Linda didn't pay much attention. She assumed they would build around her land, as many others had before. But she began to notice trucks and surveyors moving closer and closer to her property line. She asked a few questions, but most of the workers simply told her, "We're just doing our jobs." They didn't seem to know exactly where the boundaries of her property were. Weeks passed, and construction began. Heavy machines rolled in, clearing trees, flattening soil, and digging foundations. Linda was shocked when she realized they weren't just near her property, they were on it. Whole sections of land that she knew belonged to her family were being carved into streets and driveways. She watched in disbelief as homes began rising out of the ground. Friends and neighbors told her to stop it immediately. They warned her that if she waited too long, it would be too late. Some even suggested she might lose her land if she didn't fight right away. But Linda didn't panic. She had learned patience from her grandparents. She knew the value of timing. And most importantly, she knew the law was on her side. Instead of storming into the construction site or causing a public fight, she quietly went home. She pulled out the old wooden trunk and laid all the documents across her table. Every deed, every signature, Every stamp was there. She carefully organized them in order, creating a clear timeline that showed the land had always belonged to her family. The HOA, however, had no idea. They continued building as if nothing was wrong. They put up signs advertising the new neighborhood. They called it Maple Grove Estates, promising future homeowners a quiet, luxurious lifestyle. People began lining up to buy lots, excited by the idea of a brand new community. Linda said nothing. She drove past the site occasionally, watching as more and more homes were built. The numbers grew quickly, 10 homes, then 20, then 50. Before long, 96 houses stood on her family's land. Families prepared to move in, never knowing the truth about the ground beneath them. While all of this happened, Linda worked quietly behind the scenes. She met with a lawyer she trusted, a man who specialized in property law. She told him everything, showed him the deeds, and explained what was happening. He was stunned. "Do you know what this means?" he asked her. She nodded. "I know," she replied calmly. For Linda, this wasn't just about revenge or money. It was about respect. The HOA had ignored her, assumed she wouldn't notice, and taken what wasn't theirs. They thought she was powerless. But she was about to show them just how wrong they were. She let them build. She let them invest millions. She let them believe they had won. All the while, she was waiting for the right moment to step forward with her proof. It was a plan so quiet and steady that nobody suspected it. By the time the homes were nearly finished, Linda was ready. The HOA had walked directly into her trap. The sound of hammers and machines became part of the air around Linda's land. Each day, when she passed by, she saw the neighborhood growing taller and louder. Where there had once been quiet trees and soft grass, there were now cement trucks, piles of wood, and rows of workers in bright vests. The HOA and their builders were moving quickly, eager to finish what they had started. At first, Linda felt a sharp ache in her heart. She couldn't believe they had been so bold as to step right onto her land without even asking. It was almost as if they thought she didn't exist, as if her family's history and ownership meant nothing. But instead of losing her calm, she reminded herself that patience had always been her strongest weapon. The HOA was a powerful group, made up of wealthy homeowners, developers, and investors. They were used to getting their way. If they wanted a road, it was built. If they wanted new houses, they found a way to put them up. People in the town often whispered about them, saying they had more influence than the local council. They operated with money, pressure, and confidence. When the decision was made to build 96 homes in a brand new community, the HOA believed it was the perfect idea. They imagined families moving in, paying fees, and filling their pockets with profits. But in their rush to expand, they didn't study the records carefully. They relied on paperwork that was incomplete, assuming the land was available. The truth was, they had skipped over one key fact: Linda's ownership. Her land was clearly marked in county records. It wasn't abandoned, it wasn't forgotten, and it certainly wasn't for sale. But the HOA, blinded by ambition, either ignored those records or never bothered to look closely. Linda noticed this arrogance. She saw how they carried themselves as if they were untouchable. Whenever she drove by the construction site, no one paid her any attention. She was just another car on the road to them, a woman who didn't matter in their grand plan. They didn't realize the woman watching quietly from her car window was the very person who held the future of their entire project in her hands. As the homes began to take shape, Linda's friends grew worried. One of them, a neighbor named Sarah, visited her one evening. Sarah's eyes were full of concern as she said, "Linda, you can't let this go on. They're building right on your property. If you don't act now, you'll lose it." Linda smiled softly and poured Sarah a cup of tea. "I haven't lost anything," she said calmly. "They're the ones who don't know what they're losing." Sarah didn't understand at first. She thought Linda was being too relaxed, too slow to respond. But Linda knew what she was doing. She had learned from her grandmother that sometimes the best way to win a battle was to let the other side dig their own hole. And that's exactly what the HOA was doing. The houses rose one after another. Streets were paved. Sidewalks were painted. Playground equipment was installed for children who hadn't even moved in yet. The HOA announced the name of the new community with great pride: Maple Grove Estates. They held meetings, printed flyers, and put up banners showing pictures of happy families. They talked about how beautiful the neighborhood would be, how safe and clean, how it would raise property values. To the outside world, it looked like a success story in the making. But Linda knew the truth behind the pretty pictures. All of it stood on her land. One afternoon, she decided to walk through the area while the workers were busy. She wanted to see for herself how far they had gone. As she walked down the dirt road, she could see nearly finished homes lined up on both sides. Families were already visiting the site, looking inside the houses, and imagining their futures there. She overheard one young couple saying, "This will be the perfect place to raise our kids." Linda felt a tug in her chest. She wasn't heartless, she didn't want innocent families to suffer. But she also couldn't allow the HOA to get away with stealing what was rightfully hers. She reminded herself that the blame lay with those who had ignored the law, not with the families who were being misled. She stood there quietly, watching, almost invisible among the crowd. The HOA members who passed by her didn't even give her a second glance. They didn't recognize her face, didn't know her story, and didn't realize they had already stepped into a trap she was carefully preparing. The overstep was growing larger every day. By the time the 50th house was nearly complete, the HOA had invested millions of dollars. They had hired contractors, architects, and landscapers. They had promised buyers move-in dates and signed contracts for future sales. Their pride blinded them. Not one of them thought to stop and ask, what if this land isn't really ours? Linda's lawyer, however, understood the power of what was happening. When she met with him again, he shook his head in disbelief. They're building an empire on ground that doesn't belong to them. Every nail, every brick, every board is more evidence of their mistake. Linda nodded slowly. Let them keep going, she said. The bigger they build, the harder they'll fall. The lawyer admired her calmness. Most people in her position would have rushed into court, demanding an immediate stop. But Linda saw the long game. If she moved too early, the HOA might try to cover their tracks, or worse, find a way to push her aside. By staying quiet, she let them dig deeper into their own problem. As weeks turned into months, the once empty land transformed into a nearly complete community. There were now 96 homes, lined up in neat rows with driveways and small yards. Street lights were put up, mailboxes installed, and the entrance sign proudly displayed the name of Maple Grove Estates. The HOA celebrated their progress. They threw small events, inviting potential buyers to tour the homes. Smiling faces filled the streets. Music played, children laughed, and the HOA leaders walked around like kings of their castle. But beneath all the celebration, a storm was quietly forming. Linda had her documents neatly organized, her lawyer prepared, and her patience intact. She knew it was only a matter of time before the truth would come crashing down on the HOA. What they thought was their greatest achievement was about to become their greatest mistake. They had overstepped, not onto empty ground, but onto the one piece of land they should never have touched. And while they celebrated their success, Linda was quietly waiting, ready to show them just how costly their arrogance would be. Sparkles, that's the expanded part 2, around 1,300 words, engaging and simple. Linda knew the moment would come when she had to step forward, but she also knew the value of timing. Each day the HOA built more, invested more, and tied themselves deeper into the land that wasn't theirs. While they grew louder with their advertisements and celebrations, she stayed silent, moving carefully and quietly in the background. She started with her family's old wooden trunk, the one filled with documents that stretched back through generations. She opened it once more and spread the papers across her kitchen table. There were yellow deeds signed by her grandparents, legal stamps from the county office, and updated records with her own name on them. Every page told the same story: the land belonged to Linda's family and now belonged to her. She ran her fingers across the signatures, remembering her grandmother's voice reminding her that the land was precious. That memory gave her strength. She wasn't fighting for herself alone, she was standing for the generations who had worked, struggled, and sacrificed to keep that land safe. The next step was finding the right lawyer. She didn't want just anyone. She needed someone who understood the importance of property rights and who would treat her case with seriousness. After asking around and meeting with a few people, she found a lawyer named Mr. Thompson. He was experienced, calm, and known for fighting tough battles. When she first told him the situation, he raised his eyebrows in disbelief. 96 homes, he repeated, leaning back in his chair. On your land. Linda nodded and slid the stack of papers across his desk. Every single one of them. Mr. Thompson took his time, reading through the deeds and comparing them to the county maps. With each page he turned, his expression grew more serious. Finally, he looked up at Linda. "You've got them," he said firmly. "This isn't even a question. This land is yours, and everything they built is standing on your property." Linda felt relief wash over her, but she stayed calm. She already knew the truth. Now she had the legal confirmation. Together, they began building the case. Mr. Thompson made copies of every document, organized them in binders, and cross-checked them with county property lines. They even pulled up aerial maps that clearly showed the HOA's development falling right inside Linda's land. There was no mistake, no confusion. The evidence was solid. Meanwhile, outside, the HOA kept moving forward. They hosted open house events, letting potential buyers walk through finished homes. They hired photographers to take glossy pictures for their website. They put up bright signs at the entrance promising luxury living in Maple Grove Estates. Families toured the homes, imagining birthdays, holidays, and quiet nights under the stars. Linda saw all of this but remained silent. She didn't want to scare anyone too soon. She knew that once the truth came out, chaos would follow. Families would be angry, investors would panic, and the HOA would scramble to defend themselves. For now, she let them enjoy their illusion of success. But behind closed doors, she and Mr. Thompson were preparing a storm. They gathered testimonies from neighbors who had seen Linda visiting her land for years. They spoke with county officials who confirmed her ownership was on record. They even took photographs showing the property lines compared to the new houses. Every piece of evidence was another brick in the wall of her case. The more Linda prepared, the more confident she became. At night, when she drove past the glowing lights of the construction site, she didn't feel anger anymore. She felt a quiet sense of power. They thought they had taken everything from her, but in reality, they were giving her more than she ever imagined. Her friends began to notice her calmness. Sarah, the neighbor who had once worried for her, asked, "How can you stay so peaceful when they've gone this far?" Linda smiled knowingly. "Because they don't know what's waiting for them," she said. The trap was nearly complete. She had her lawyer, her documents, her witnesses, and her proof. And with each passing day, the HOA tightened the noose around their own neck by investing more money, more time, and more promises into homes they didn't legally own. Mr. Thompson explained it clearly. They built 96 houses on land that isn't theirs. That means every house belongs to you. The law will see it that way. They can argue all they want, but once this case goes to court, the judge won't have any choice. Linda nodded, her heart steady. "Then let them finish," she said. "The bigger they build, the bigger the fall." By now, The HOA leaders had grown proud. They walked around the site in suits, shaking hands with buyers and giving speeches about their vision for the future. They didn't realize that Linda, a quiet woman they ignored, was the true owner of the land they were standing on. The trap was invisible to them, hidden in plain sight. They were so focused on their success that they couldn't see the danger under their feet. They believed they were unstoppable, untouchable. But Linda had built her case with patience, and when the time came, it would strike like lightning. One evening, as Linda stood at the edge of her property, she looked out at the rows of houses glowing in the sunset. She thought about her grandparents and how proud they would be if they could see her now. She whispered softly, "I didn't let them take it. I held on, just like you told me to." The land was more than earth. It was her history, her family's story, and now it was her shield. The HOA had stepped straight into her plan, and soon, they would find out the truth. Linda didn't need anger, shouting, or revenge. She had something stronger: patience, proof, and the power of the law. Her trap was set, and there was no escape for the people who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. The day finally came when Linda and her lawyer decided it was time to step forward. The houses were finished, the streets were named, and families were preparing to move in. The HOA was celebrating its success, confident that everything had gone according to plan. They didn't realize that their celebration would soon turn into their downfall. Mr. Thompson filed the case in the county court. The documents were thick, filled with every piece of proof they had carefully gathered. At the top of the file was the deed with Linda's name, signed and sealed, showing her as the rightful owner of the land where 96 homes now stood. When the case was officially accepted, it sent shockwaves through the town. The news spread quickly. People were stunned. "You mean the whole neighborhood isn't theirs?" one man asked at the local diner. "All those houses, they're built on her land." The story traveled from neighbor to neighbor, then to reporters, who quickly realized this was bigger than a local issue. It was a lesson in arrogance, law, and justice. The HOA, once so proud, was shaken when they received the legal notice. Their lawyers gathered in emergency meetings, their voices raised as they argued over what to do. "We acted in good faith," one of them said. "We thought the land was clear." But excuses didn't erase the fact that they had built an entire community on land that wasn't theirs. Linda stayed calm. On the morning of the first court hearing, she dressed simply but neatly. She didn't need fancy clothes to prove her worth. All she needed was the truth. She walked into the courthouse with Mr. Thompson by her side, her head held high. Though she was quiet, her presence filled the room. People turned to look at her, curious about the woman who had stood up to such a powerful organization. When the session began, the judge asked both sides to present their cases. The HOA's lawyers spoke first. They tried to paint a picture of confusion, claiming that the paperwork had been unclear and that they had relied on information given to them by developers. They argued that it was an honest mistake, not an intentional act. But when it was Mr. Thompson's turn, he stood with confidence. He opened the binder of documents and carefully laid them out. One by one, he showed the judge the deeds, the signatures, the maps, and the county records. He traced the history of the land from Linda's grandparents to Linda herself. Every detail matched perfectly. "This land has never belonged to the HOA," Mr. Thompson said firmly. "It has always belonged to my client. They ignored the records. They ignored the law. And now, 96 homes stand on property that does not belong to them." The courtroom was silent. The HOA leaders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some of them avoided looking at Linda. Others whispered frantically to their lawyers. The judge leaned forward, studying the documents with a serious expression. Linda sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't need to speak much, the papers spoke for her. But when the judge asked if she had anything to add, she stood and addressed the court in her calm, steady voice. "This land was my grandparents'," she said softly. They worked for it, they fought to keep it, and they passed it down to me. I didn't sell it. I didn't give it away. It is still mine. They built those homes without my permission, and they thought I would stay silent. But I am here today because my family's legacy deserves respect. This is not just dirt under their houses, it is history. Her words moved people in the courtroom. Some nodded in agreement. Even a few reporters scribbled quickly, realizing they had just heard the heart of the story. The HOA lawyers tried to fight back. They claimed Linda had waited too long to speak up, that she had allowed the houses to be built without warning them. But Mr. Thompson countered swiftly. My client has no responsibility to monitor the mistakes of a billion-dollar organization. It was their duty to check the records, and they failed. Their carelessness is not her fault. As the evidence piled up against them, the HOA grew desperate. They whispered about settlements, about offering Linda money to make the case disappear. But the truth was too heavy. The judge could see the facts clearly. Over several hearings, the case drew more attention. News cameras began showing up outside the courthouse. People in town followed the story closely. Many of them saw Linda as a symbol of strength, someone who stood against power and refused to be ignored. Finally, after weeks of arguments, the judge delivered his ruling. His voice was steady, his words clear. The court finds that the land in question belongs solely to the plaintiff, Miss Linda. The development of Maple Grove Estates was conducted without legal ownership of the property. Therefore, all 96 homes stand on land that rightfully belongs to Miss Linda. The words echoed through the room. Linda closed her eyes for a moment, letting the relief wash over her. She had won. The HOA leaders looked defeated. Their faces were pale, their shoulders heavy. They had thought their wealth and influence would protect them, but the law had spoken against them. Families who had been preparing to move into the new homes were shocked. Investors were furious. The entire project was in ruins. Reporters rushed out to share the news. Headlines quickly appeared: Woman wins land battle against HOA. 96 homes built on wrong property. David defeats Goliath in courtroom showdown. As Linda left the courthouse, people stopped her to shake her hand. Some thanked her for standing strong, others told her she had inspired them to protect what was theirs. She didn't boast or raise her voice. She simply nodded and said, "I only did what was right." The showdown was over, but the story was far from finished. Linda had not only protected her land but also gained control of an entire neighborhood. What she chose to do next would shape her future in ways she had never imagined. And Linda walked out of the courthouse that day. The world outside felt different. The same sky stretched above her, the same town stood around her, but something inside her heart had shifted. For the first time, she felt the full weight of her victory. She had gone against a powerful HOA, a group that thought they could silence her, and she had stood her ground until justice was served. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, townspeople, and even curious strangers who had followed the case. Microphones were held out, cameras flashed, and questions were thrown at her from every direction. "How do you feel winning against such a big organization?" one reporter asked. Another shouted, "What will you do with the homes now?" Linda didn't raise her voice or let the noise overwhelm her. She spoke softly, yet her words carried power. "This land has always been mine," she said. "Now the world knows it too. What happens next will be on my terms, not theirs." The crowd clapped, and a few even cheered. It wasn't just about houses or land anymore, it was about a woman who had proved that patience, truth, and courage could defeat greed and arrogance. In the weeks that followed, the news spread far beyond her town. Newspapers wrote long articles about her story. Television channels invited legal experts to discuss the case. Social media buzzed with people calling Linda an inspiration. Many said she was proof that ordinary people could win against powerful organizations if they stood up for themselves. Meanwhile, the HOA was in ruins. Their leaders resigned one by one, their investors pulled out, and their name became a symbol of failure. Families who had been planning to buy homes in Maple Grove Estates demanded answers, furious that they had been misled. Developers who had poured millions into the project were left scrambling, their dreams crushed. And at the center of it all stood Linda, the woman who now legally owned not just the land, but also the 96 homes built on it. At first, she found it overwhelming. She had never imagined owning so much property. Overnight, she had gone from being the quiet guardian of family land to the owner of an entire neighborhood. People came to her with offers, ideas, and advice. Some told her to sell the homes immediately and take the profit. Others urged her to rent them out and create a steady income. A few even asked her to donate the homes to people in need. Linda listened to all of them, but she didn't rush. She remembered how patience had brought her this far, and she knew patience would guide her again. She spent long evenings walking through the neighborhood, visiting each house. She would step onto the porches, peek inside the empty living rooms, and imagine the lives that could one day fill them. Each home was different, but together they told a story not of the HOA, but of her resilience. She thought about how her grandparents had once stood on this land with nothing but determination, and now there were rows of houses stretching across it. The land had transformed, but its spirit was still hers. After careful thought, Linda made her decision. She would keep control of the homes but use them in ways that honored her family's legacy. Some of the houses she decided to rent at fair prices, giving families a chance to live in safe, beautiful homes without being exploited. Others she sold, but only to people who truly respected the value of the land. And a few, she set aside for community projects, spaces where children could learn, where families could gather, and where her town could grow stronger together. Her choices surprised many people. Some expected her to take the fastest road to wealth, but Linda wasn't motivated by greed. She believed the real victory wasn't just in winning the case, it was in shaping a future that mattered. As time passed, Maple Grove Estates became something new. No longer a symbol of the HOA's arrogance, it became a neighborhood known for fairness, community, and history. Families moved in, children played in the yards, and laughter filled the streets. And every person who lived there knew the story of the woman who had fought for the land beneath their feet. For Linda, life didn't suddenly become easy. Managing the homes came with challenges, repairs, agreements, and endless decisions. But she faced them with the same steady patience she had shown during the battle. And whenever she felt overwhelmed, she would walk to the edge of the neighborhood where the oldest oak tree still stood. Sitting under its shade, she would remember her grandmother's words, "This ground carries our blood, our sweat, and our hope." One afternoon, as she sat under that tree, Sarah, her friend, joined her. Sarah looked around at the rows of homes and smiled. "You did it," she said. "You really did it?" Linda nodded, her eyes soft but proud. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "This land gave me strength. My grandparents gave me wisdom. And patience gave me power." Sarah laughed. "And the HOA gave you 96 houses." Linda smiled. "Yes," she said quietly. "They built me an entire neighborhood without even knowing it." That line became a favorite among the townspeople. People often repeated it when telling her story. She didn't just win, she let them build her victory with their own hands. Years later, Linda's story was still remembered. Schools taught it as an example of standing up for what is right. Lawyers mentioned it in lectures about property rights. And families in Maple Grove Estates told it to their children, reminding them that courage and patience can change everything. Linda herself remained humble. She never sought fame, never bragged about her victory. She lived simply, walking through the streets of her neighborhood, greeting families with warmth. She carried herself with the quiet strength that had guided her all along. Her land was no longer just a piece of property. It had become a living legacy, a reminder that no matter how powerful an organization might seem, truth cannot be buried, and history cannot be stolen. In the end, Linda didn't just protect her family's land. She transformed it into a future her grandparents could only have dreamed of. She turned an injustice into triumph, silence into strength, and a trap into a legacy. And every time she walked through Maple Grove Estates, past the homes the HOA had built, she knew the truth: the land had always been hers. Now, so was the victory.